On behalf of faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining this evening's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this evening's program, I would like to remind you to turn off any cell phones or devices that make noise. Tonight's speaker, Kate Andersen Brower, is a New York Times bestseller for her book, The Residents, which focuses on stories of the White House staff, as well as her book, First Women, which looks exclusively into the lives of various first ladies. She's a contributor to CNN, covered the first term of the Obama administration with Bloomberg News, and is a former CBS News staffer and Fox News producer. She graduated from Barnard College and received her master's degree in modern history from the University of Oxford. She lives outside Washington, D.C. with her husband, their 2 young children, and their Wheaton Terrier. Tonight, Mrs. Browers will speak on her latest book, First in Line, Presidents, Vice Presidents, and the Pursuit of Power, as part of the Institute's bookmark series. Following Mrs. Brower's remarks, we will have a brief question and answer period. Please be sure to use one of the microphones to ask your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kate Andersen Brower.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and also Anne for inviting me here. It is a wonderful school, and I'm really impressed with the Institute. I got a little tour of it earlier, and it was neat to see the library with all of the presidential books. That was very special. So I'm honored to be here. As Sarah said, I started my career out at the very beginning, I started out as a CBS News staffer in New York City, and I was working overnights on the morning show, and then I moved to DC, where I worked at Fox News as a producer, booking guests, and then I went to Bloomberg News, where I covered the White House. And the reason why I decided to write The Residents, my first book, which came out in 2015, was because as one of the female reporters, and this is one of those sexist things that happens, I was assigned to cover Michelle Obama, but it was actually a wonderful thing because I learned a lot in that time covering her as First Lady. And at a lunch with Mrs. Obama and about a dozen of us East Wing reporters, a butler came in and out of the state dining room where they were serving this very elegant lunch where Michelle Obama was talking about her Let's Move campaign. And she was on a first name basis with this butler who was dressed in a tuxedo. He was African American, and I thought, who are these people who we never get to see? It's kind of like a Downton Abbey at the White House. So I left my job. I was pregnant with our first child, and I realized that my schedule was not going to work because I was working from, at the White House you work ridiculous hours. And I decided to take a chance and go out and find these people who are the 100 butlers, maids, groundskeepers, engineers. I just talked to a White House engineer who worked during the Trump administration. I've been in touch with some people who are there now who have amazing stories. And they have not signed non-disclosure agreements, which is especially interesting. So I'm looking forward to doing an update of this book someday. But it was a wonderful experience because these are the people who see the President and First Lady in their most private moments on the second and third floors of the White House. So these are this is the family's home, and they have staff there 24/7. There are always butlers on duty. I have been told that actually, which I think is fascinating, that President Trump and Melania Trump are close to the staff and have a good relationship with them, with many of the butlers on the second floor. And I think part of that might be because they're used to having staff. The Bush family also had a great relationship with the staff too. Bush 41 and Barbara Bush were beloved. They would call florists at home. If a member of your family passed away, they'd be the first ones to call, to express their condolences. It was just very personal. Laura Bush even went to a butler's funeral and delivered the eulogy. So these are real relationships, and in a time of such partisanship, it's very nice to know it exists. Here are a bunch of butlers. I started this book before the movie The Butler came out. We have, right here is Eugene Allen, and The Butler was based on his life. And he had passed away by the time I was working on this book in 2013, 2014. And his son said that his dad and mom were just good, solid people and pretty boring. And so if you've seen the movie The Butler, they've got Oprah playing the mom, and she's an alcoholic, and they had to really change his life up a lot. But it's incredible because they're mostly African Americans, still mostly African American butlers who work on the second and third floor. And many of them, there was a point in the 60s where they asked for a raise, and that was part of the movie The Butler. So that is true. These are my first two books I'll go through quickly before I get to my latest book, First in Line, about the vice presidency. But with all three of my books, I'm trying to look at history through a different perspective. So it's not from the president's perspective, it's from the perspective, in this case, of the White House staff. Here you have Jacqueline Kennedy with John Kennedy Jr. This is when they are leaving the White House, and the gentleman to her right is named Preston Bruce with the white hair, and they were very close. So close that he was, the son of a sharecropper, never graduated from high school, and there he was standing behind Charles de Gaulle at Kennedy's funeral because she invited him to attend the funeral. And she really opened up to him when Kennedy's body was brought back from Dallas. She and Robert Kennedy and Preston Bruce hugged and cried in the White House elevator, which to me is really important to know that the elevator is one of the only places where the president and first lady are ever really alone. They're always feeling like they're being watched, and I think that it's kind of a nice thing to have that friendship. This is one of the butlers. I went and interviewed more than 50 of them. His name was Linwood Westray. A lot of them passed away, unfortunately, since this book came out. He started this company called the Private Butlers Incorporated, where they would go out and work at Georgetown dinner parties. And he said that all of the hostesses love to brag and say, "Here's Mr. Westray, a White House butler serving you tonight." And so he made a lot of money, he said, on the side with this group that he founded. This is an amazing story of a White House nanny named Mary Prince. She was actually, and I was telling Ann this, and I just went down to Plains, Georgia to talk to the Carters. She still lives with them, lives down the street from them in this tiny town in Plains. I encourage you all to, if you're ever near Atlanta, it's about a 2-hour drive from Atlanta. President Carter still delivers Sunday school when he's in town. And Mrs. Carter is there, and they pose for photos, and it's kind of amazing. Mary was actually in prison for murder, and she was on this work release program when Carter was governor of Georgia, and she would be helping with other female prisoners tend to the grounds, and she really took a liking to Amy, who at the time was 7, 8. She was 9 when she moved into the White House. And Rosalind noticed how close they were, and she wanted to hire Mary to be Amy's nanny, and she thought that Mary was unfairly imprisoned. She met her lawyer the day of her trial. This is an African American woman. This is in, she was convicted in the 60s. And so the Carters saved her, really. I mean, Jimmy Carter became her parole officer when he was president. And Rosalind Carter brought her to the White House, and she was eventually exonerated from this crime. So that story to me is amazing, to have a nanny in the White House who had been unfairly convicted of murder. This is George H.W. Bush and one of the staffers, Lindsay Little. He's wearing a shirt there that says Houseman's Pride. And so in the summer, the Bushes would play horseshoes. And when I interviewed Barbara Bush, she said one of the saddest things about losing to Clinton was that they were going to whip out the horseshoe pit, which I don't think was probably the saddest thing, but she was very upset about this. The Bushes loved the staff. They had these tournaments. The staff really enjoyed it. They took it very seriously and had t-shirts made up. I interviewed Lindsay Little, this houseman, and a houseman is essentially like a housekeeper who moves heavy furniture in the residence so that maids can vacuum around it. And he said that, you know, it was essentially like a primary. They took this very, very seriously. And I think that seeing these lighter moments of the president and first lady are really revealing. I love the horseshoe stories. Here's Barbara Bush visiting the flower shop in the basement of the White House. The White House is actually 6 floors. There are 2 basement levels where you have the flower shop, you have a kitchen. And some of the stories in the book, I mean, you can't make up. The executive pastry chef and the executive chef would argue so much that during the Clinton years that they had to build a separate kitchen for the pastry chef because they fought so much. And they wouldn't communicate, and so the executive chef would slip a menu underneath the door of the pastry chef's little kitchen. So there's a lot of drama going on there. Here are the Clintons saying goodbye to the staff. This happens on Inauguration Day when everyone's eyes are trained on the Capitol. What's going on inside the White House, I think, is equally compelling. The staff who have been with them for 4 to 8 years are saying goodbye. There's usually not a dry eye in the house, and it's really quite sweet. This is James Ramsey and George W. Bush. Again, they were very close. James Ramsey was a White House butler for years and years, and when he passed away, Laura Bush flew from Dallas to DC to deliver his eulogy with Jenna Bush. And it was funny because I went to interview him, and he had a really modest apartment outside of DC, but on the walls were pictures of himself with the Pope and with the Queen of England. I mean, it was just amazing. And he had a great sense of humor, and the presidents loved him because he kind of lightened the mood in the residence. This is Stephen Rochon. Here you see a bunch of White House chefs. You see electricians and plumbers. Again, there are about 100 of these people who work from one administration to the next. They are not partisan. So the people who are working for Trump right now worked for Obama, worked for Clinton, worked for Bush. They stay on for 35 years, I think, until they get retirement, most of them. This is Stephen Rochon, who is the chief usher of the White House, so kind of the general manager. He's giving Bush the American flag. This happens every time there's a change in the presidency, and it is the flag that flew on his last day in office and his first day in office. And the carpenters in the carpenter shop at the White House make this cedar box, and they present it to the president on his last day in office. And President Obama is Stephen Rochon. This is the chief usher again. He talked a lot with Obama about the tennis court being converted into a basketball court and things like that. Obama would talk to him. It was Stephen flew out to, I think it was some Oregon. It was very far from DC, and he flew to go pick out Sasha and Malia's little playscape in the little jungle gym on the South Lawn. So they are hands-on. Michelle Obama with a butler, George Haney. I wrote a book about first ladies here, and in this book I talk a bit about how she always saw herself as different from the other first ladies because she was the first African-American first lady. And I'm reading her book, Becoming, now, which is great. And she says in the book she always felt she had more in common with Rosa Parks and Coretta Scott King than she ever did with Eleanor Roosevelt. And so I think her unique place in our history is really fascinating. So the reason why I did this book on first ladies is because when I would interview staffers at the residence, they always said when a decision came from the second floor, it meant it was serious. And the second floor is the first lady, is kind of how they speak of the first lady. And they're always a little bit afraid. They want to please her. The first lady runs the White House. She runs the residence. And she works with her social secretary and with the chief usher on state dinners and meal planning. A lot of people don't realize that they pay for their own food in the White House. When they're having just dinner with their family, they're paying for it. So Gerald Ford would see a charge for coffee and tell his daughter Susan, I saw you had friends over yesterday, that's interesting. And she joked to me that he was always looking at the bill. Rosalind Carter told me that she was upset with the bill and she would try to get them to serve leftovers because it was just getting so expensive. And it is expensive to live in the White House, and the argument could be made they didn't have a lot of money, unlike some of the other families initially. I love this photo because it shows Pat Nixon, Mamie Eisenhower, Lady Bird Johnson, Jackie Kennedy. This is at Kennedy's swearing in at the Capitol. There was a really interesting bond really between Lady Bird and Jackie Kennedy. And what I did was look through a lot of letters between them back when people used to write letters. And you can see Lady Bird's, filling in for Jackie a lot. There were a lot of times that Mrs. Kennedy didn't want to do certain events, and Lady Bird Johnson filled in so often and was very eager to help as the Vice President's wife, and Kennedy's staff took to calling her Saint Bird because she came through so often for her. Mamie Eisenhower loved living in the White House. She didn't see her husband that much during World War II, obviously, so it was the time that she grew closest to him. She resented the Kennedys. They were from a different political party, obviously, and the sense she would call Jackie the college girl. There was just some animosity there, and there's a very kind of catty story about how Jackie was recovering from a C-section, and she went to the White House for her tour, and she had asked for a wheelchair. This is after the birth of John Kennedy Jr., and Mamie conveniently never offered her a wheelchair. So she walked through this giant house and was in so much pain that when she left, she had to rest and recuperate for days. So there was definitely some bad blood there. I love this photo because Jackie Kennedy with Caroline and John Kennedy Jr. and the residence, she famously said, if you bungle being a good mother, nothing else you do matters very much. She was hands-on. Now they had a nanny, Maud Shaw, who lived in the White House and did a lot of the heavy lifting. I don't think she was changing diapers and things like that, but she was a very involved parent, and she had a kindergarten set up for Caroline on the 3rd floor of the White House. They call the room the solarium, which is this big open room with a beautiful view of the South Lawn and the Washington Monument. And it was there that Caroline went to school with a handful of their friends that they knew in Georgetown. And after JFK was killed, Caroline continued going there so he was killed in November. She finished that semester out there. And I interviewed a couple of White House staffers who said how happy they were to see her have a semblance of a normal life, to keep her routine going. So they would see her car pull up to the White House and get out, and it made them happy to see her again, but also obviously very sad. It was a bittersweet thing to see her and her kindergarten friends at that time. I love this photo of Betty Ford standing on the cabinet room table. She was a trained Martha Graham dancer. She said she thought this was the closest she would get to a seat at the table. And she was a really important first lady, and I write in my book about how she was loved by the other first ladies. I obviously didn't get to interview her. She had passed away by the time I started working on this book, but her ability to talk about her addiction to alcohol and painkillers, and to start the Betty Ford Center, and also what she did talking about breast cancer in the White House when it was something that people didn't talk about. That was really important and powerful. So she's a very, very important First Lady. Here's Rosalind Carter and Jimmy Carter having lunch in the Oval Office. She insisted on these weekly lunches with the president because she is she's like a powerhouse, very interested in politics. In some ways, when I talked to people around Carter, they said that she was more political than he was. When he ran against Reagan, she would encourage him. For him, there would be a policy that and I forget the specifics of it, but something having to do with New York State, and he felt it was important to push through before the election, and she told him to wait until afterwards, and he didn't listen to her, and she always kind of blamed him for that. But it's interesting that she, I don't think gets as much attention as Nancy Reagan, but she is somebody who, everything that, there were no secrets between them. They spoke Spanish to each other with other people in the room because they communicate privately with each other sometimes, with senior aides around them even. When he was dealing with the Iran hostage crisis, she was out in the country knocking, well, not at that point knocking on doors, but campaigning for her husband. So she wanted to know about his policies. And that's why she did these lunches, because she said, listen, I have so many people coming up to me asking questions, and I want to know where we stand on these issues. So when I interviewed, Brzezinski and other people around Carter, they just said there was absolutely nothing that these two didn't share. In fact, she was instrumental in the Camp David peace accords. She insisted that they be held at Camp David. She grew very close to Anwar Sadat's wife. She took copious notes at the Accords and really built a relationship with Sadat's wife. That's very interesting. And so I think that she's a first lady who was powerful, and I don't think that we knew it at the time. This is a great photo of Lady Bird and Barbara Bush laughing in a great sense of humor. Wonderful, notes between them, birthday cards. You can see in the libraries, and Lady Bird was special. She was kind of the grande dame of the First Lady. She lived about half her life after her husband died, and she had a checklist of things she wanted to do, and she traveled, and she cared about the other First Ladies. When they were going through a difficult time, she would check in. During the Gulf War, she would call Barbara Bush and express, say, and write letters to her, just to let her know she was thinking of them. And it's interesting because it's a Democrat and a Republican. It's very sweet. This is at Lady Bird Johnson's ranch. LBJ was a very difficult personality and essentially a manic depressive. I mean, I have talked to a lot of people who worked for him who love him and say that he could never have been president without her kind of stabilizing influence. And here she is with Rosalind Carter, Betty Ford on the porch of the ranch, and a tour group was going by that day, and they had no idea that 3 former First Ladies would be there. So they were very, very excited, and all the cameras started going off. And Rosalind Carter talked a little bit to me about the friendship that she had formed with Mrs. Ford and how they really supported each other's work, both financially. Betty Ford would give donations to the Carter Center, but also they would show up at events with each other. The Equal Rights Amendment was something that they worked together on, which did not pass, but they grew very close. This is an interesting photo because it shows Nancy Reagan kind of looking off here. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times when she passed away, and it was titled "The Happiest First Lady." And I think in many ways she was, and I think we see with Melania Trump now trying to publicly get rid of a member of her husband's administration. A lot of people are comparing her to Nancy Reagan. Of course, Nancy Reagan wouldn't do anything as public as that. She privately was able to get rid of Don Regan, and she did it in a very smart way. And she was obviously very protective and very close to her husband. And she really enjoyed life in the White House. I interviewed some chefs. There's one story about a White House chef a pastry chef who was so upset he couldn't find the right dessert for the royal family of the Netherlands were coming to visit. And he presented her this is this larger-than-life French chef, Roland Mesnier, and he was there for decades at the White House, and he described to me presenting Nancy Reagan with 3 choices for dessert, and Nancy Reagan and President Reagan would sit and try them, and nothing was good enough. And he said the day before the state dinner was going to happen, he was like desperate. He said, "I need you to approve something." And he said, you know, I only have a day left to find a dessert for the state dinner. And she told him, "You have 1 day and 1 night." And that was the kind of person she was. So he stayed up all night and worked on the dessert. And then he presented it to her, and she loved it. And so that's the kind of person she was. She was a perfectionist, but if you gave her what she wanted, she was thankful for it. Some of the staff told me that they liked that about her because they knew where she stood. If you gave her what she wanted, she was happy. She had a difficult relationship with Barbara Bush, but you see Barbara Bush here with Betty Ford, Rosalind Carter looking on, Lady Bird and Hillary Clinton, you know, shared a lot of lovely letters together. Lady Bird Johnson was very complimentary about Hillary Clinton's healthcare initiative. The book that I am ostensibly talking about tonight is my book on vice presidents. I wanted to do this book because I just thought it was a different way of looking at the presidency through the eyes of the second. You know, many times, many cases, the runner-up. There have been 48 VPs, and only 14 have become president. 8 because the death of a sitting president. Only 4 went directly to the presidency. So you have Adams, Jefferson, Van Buren, and Bush 41. Mike Pence, incidentally, his favorite predecessor is Bush 41, and I think in part because he's the only one who actually became president, and Mike Pence wants to one day be president, as most vice presidents do. I was fortunate enough to interview every living former VP. There are 6 of them. The easiest person to interview for this book, aside from Walter Mondale, who's pretty easy to interview and very, very nice, he's Jimmy Carter's VP, was Dick Cheney. He lives outside of DC. I know he looks miserable in this photo, but I promise you he's smiling. He was really, he has a real interest in history, and it's not just me. I mean, he talks to reporters a lot, he talks to authors. He worked for Nixon, he worked for Ford, he was Bush 41's defense secretary, and then of course he was the most powerful vice president in history. So he was someone who, you know, he has a fairly modest, I mean it's nice, but it's a home outside of DC, and he only has one valet he took with him, so sort of a personal assistant he took with him from the observatory, which is where the vice presidents live, to work at his house, and I thought that was interesting. When I was a Bloomberg reporter, I went to Mongolia and Japan and China with Biden and covered him, you know, during the 2012 campaign. He is, what you see is what you get. My experience with him has always been that he's very outgoing, kind. I'm sure you guys have had him here. We'll have him here again because I'm thinking he's probably running. He was very much, you know, he's obviously very emotional, and so when he was talking about his son Beau's death, he talked about how he stopped actually talking about it with President Obama because it became so emotional for Obama that Obama would start crying, and so Biden didn't want to upset Obama with it. So I thought that was very sweet. I mean, they definitely, in my reporting, I was surprised to discover that of all the modern vice presidents, so I'm starting really with, I consider it's, you know, LBJ and Kennedy, let's say. Of all of the modern vice presidents, Biden and Obama had the only relationship that grew stronger over time. All the other ones really deteriorated. The hardest vice president to interview for me, in my case, was Al Gore. And I finally got a phone interview with him He does not like to relive the vice presidency, I think, because of the 2000 election. And so I asked him about what it was like working in a White House with essentially, two people to report to, a president and a first lady, who was so powerful. And he said, and this is a phone interview, he said, I think our interview is almost over, which to me was a sign that he did not want to talk about Hillary Clinton. It was a tough time for him in that there was always he wanted to do reorganizing government, she wanted to focus on healthcare, and they went with healthcare. Usually first ladies end up winning battles, and I think you see that with Melania Trump today. Harry Truman, amazing story. I start the book, I talk a bit about him, only in that he was a role model. Jimmy Carter said, I didn't want my vice president to go through what Harry Truman went through, which is that FDR died suddenly. Truman didn't know anything about the atomic bomb. He, of course, becomes the first president to have to make this terrible decision to use it, and he knows nothing about it. And so Jimmy Carter said to me that, he wanted Walter Mondale, and Jimmy Carter and Mondale are really the people who created the modern vice president, to have weekly lunches. He office in the West Wing, although Spiro Agnew had an office in the West Wing, but he was a kind of a mess. But the Mondale-Carter relationship, and this is not partisan in any way, because any vice president would say this, including Mike Pence, is the kind of gold standard for vice presidents now. And Carter said, it's because he wanted the vice president to be able to step in whenever, moment's notice. Here is the observatory. This is the Reagans visiting the Bushes, the observatory. Reagan and Bush had a very good relationship. In fact, just this morning I had coffee with Chase Untermeyer, who worked for Bush, who said that when Reagan was almost assassinated, and we didn't know how close to death he really was, Bush made the decision as vice president, and this is a famous story, not to land the helicopter. So Bush was traveling when John Hinckley shot Reagan. He came back from his trip, obviously early, and he was urged, Reagan aides urged him to land on the South Lawn and come straight to the White House. He thought that was disrespectful to the president. And I learned this morning he also didn't want to disturb Nancy Reagan because he thought she might be resting at that time by the time he got home, which is kind of typical of H.W. Bush. He was very considerate of other people. And also he refused to sit in the president's chair. He wasn't hanging out in the Oval Office when Reagan was in the hospital. I interviewed Bush. Unfortunately, his health is really failing. And when I was working on this book, like a couple of years ago, I had to just submit written questions. And I asked him for his favorite memory working for Ronald Reagan. And he said, history will be the judge of my vice presidency. But he said his favorite memory of something that he thinks sums up Ronald Reagan was that when he went to visit Reagan in the hospital after he had been shot, Reagan was on his hands and knees cleaning up water that he had spilled. And he didn't want the nurses to get in trouble or to have to do it. And so Bush just said it was just so typical of him to be doing that. So, these two had they were friends, and I think that that's interesting. And it didn't get better over time. I think it was always pretty fine, whereas Biden and Obama's relationship really deepened over time, and it was not always good at the beginning, which I didn't know. But Biden even said, look, I didn't really want to be vice president. He wanted to be president. Here we have Quayle, who's most famous probably for misspelling potato, right? And he is very defensive. I interviewed him in his office in New York, and I walked into the room and he took one look at me and said, oh, you wrote something about my wife that I didn't like in your last book. I was like, oh, this is not going to go well. But he was actually very open, again, wanted to praise George H.W. Bush. A lot of people around Bush, and even Bush himself, has said they regret the way that quail was announced. It was done at the last minute. Bush wanted to hold this very tight to the vest. He didn't even tell Reagan until he got on the airplane to New Orleans, where they announced quail as his pick. He was a young, fairly inexperienced senator, and there were some things along the way where he didn't feel like he had backup. Lee Atwater told Quayle at one point, "It's good that the press is chasing you over here and making fun of you, because that takes some of the heat off of us." And so there is an element of that for vice presidents, where they kind of act as, the foil or kind of the fall guy in a lot of cases for the president. You have the Clintons and the Gores, where they first started running. It was these young baby boomers couple, and they did get along really well. That was true according to people around them. It was genuine. It just disintegrated over time, in part because of obviously the Lewinsky scandal coming close enough to the 2000 election where Gore really made the choice to distance himself from Clinton. And a lot of Clinton, in hindsight is 2020, but a lot of former Clinton aides think that was a big mistake, that Gore should have asked Clinton for help, especially in Arkansas, and he didn't. And he didn't think he needed to, but obviously he did. This is a great photo because it's the residence elevator, and there's a residence doorman, Herman Thompson, who I interviewed for my first book. And you have this moment where they don't look so happy, and I think it says a lot about how their relationship crumbled. Even Cheney told me that his influence waned in the second term. One ambassador described him as the grouchy old uncle yelling at the kids to get off the grass, that he was just a really curmudgeon. No one listened to him. At the end of the Bush presidency, Condoleezza Rice became much more powerful. Cheney explains it, saying that Bush just felt more comfortable at that point being president. But there's a story that's very specific in the book that I describe, where it's a nuclear reactor that Cheney has evidence that the North Koreans are building in Iran, and he wants the US to take it out, and he couldn't get any support for it. And eventually Israel took it out. But he was presenting photos and evidence, and no one would listen to him, and no one agreed with him. And so it was a moment, really, a very concrete example where no one was listening to him. I love this photo because Biden and Obama, this is a joke where Obama was teasing him about actually sticking to his time limit for his speech, where he was introducing him. And I think this might have been in New Hampshire. I don't know, I have the caption in my book. But Biden famously talked forever, and it was sometimes difficult. And David Axelrod, I interviewed him for the book, and he describes going to Wilmington to meet with Biden as a potential VP and saying, we have a problem with how loquacious you are, it's just we need to be careful. And then Biden said, yes, I know, and then proceeded to talk for 20 minutes. But he said brilliant things, and there were many times where Biden did stick his foot in his mouth, but in the end, they really formed a very close relationship. There was some tension about Biden's kind of reverence and respect for the institution of the Senate, and Obama would tease him, when he would come back from the Hill and be like, "You love those guys up there, don't you?" And Obama, has been said, did not have a great relationship and did not reach out to members on the Hill. A lot of people will say that might be because Mitch McConnell said that his goal was to make Obama a one-term president. So Obama wasn't particularly excited about forming relationships on the Hill. So quickly, taking us to the modern day, I did some reporting for the book that I thought was interesting. Melania Trump was there, and I think we see this today with her coming out and wanting someone to be fired. She was part of the deliberations along with all of Trump's children, except for Tiffany and Barron, where she was there with top vetting lawyers, Donald Trump Jr., Eric, and candidate Trump at the time. And she said, whoever is chosen must be clean. And I thought that showed a lot, I thought that showed that she was kind of astute, that this was something that she felt very important, realizing, you had Chris Christie, you had Newt Gingrich, you had these people who came with a lot of baggage. And she realized that her husband needed somebody who didn't have that baggage, and he got it in Mike Pence. Here you have Mike Pence, Walter Mondale, Joe Biden. I like this photo is when Biden is swearing in a new senator. I think this was last year. I just talked to Pence's, one of Pence's aides who said this was the last time that Biden and Pence have spoken, which I thought was interesting because it is a while ago. When I interviewed Biden for this book, he told me that he was like a conduit to the Trump White House. He was talking to Pence every few weeks. My sense now, and also Dick Cheney told me he was talking to Pence too, that has stopped. I called Cheney maybe 3 weeks ago, and he said he hasn't talked to them in months. And that's the problem for this White House, that there isn't a lot of communication with predecessors, and there usually is at least some. I just love this quote, I am vice president, in this I am nothing, but I may be everything, John Adams. And I think this a lot about the vice presidency and the relationships that vice presidents have with the president. I know a couple points in my book that were new, or that John Kelly and Nick Ayers, who is Mike Pence's chief of staff, sit in on these lunches. There are weekly lunches between the president and the vice president, and they essentially are chaperoned lunches in this White House, which is very, very unusual. And I think that might have to do with a lot of different things, but one of them is to keep the conversation on track, because Trump can go off on tangents. And another one is just to have somebody there who knows what's happening, so that when Pence has a question, he can come back and ask for clarification. And you could, as if you're cynical about it, it could also be, if they're talking about the Mueller investigation or Russia, to have just somebody else in the room who can remember what's discussed. But I think it's an interesting dynamic. I think Pence is a very powerful vice president. I was told he liked this book, and I don't know if I should be flattered by that or upset, because you don't ever want someone to like what you wrote about them necessarily, because you want to just be honest as a journalist. He is very powerful. He grew up with a very tyrannical father, and I think that has helped him deal with Trump. He's a larger-than-life personality, and Pence is very deferential. He wants to be president someday, so he kind of walks on eggshells. But he also spends hours and hours in the Oval Office every day. He is somebody who talks to our allies around the world and calms them down if they're worried about something. There's a specific example in the book where Trump was threatening military action in Venezuela. It's hard to keep this straight. This was at the beginning of his administration. And Pence was in South America at the time and said, no, he doesn't really mean that to the Venezuelan president. And so he walks things back. He's an interpreter for Trump. He is a more traditional politician than Donald Trump. And in many ways, that's a very important thing. So he plays a very important role for this president. But every time I got close to interviewing him, it was canceled. And even so close that I had my social security number. If you go to the White House to interview someone, you have to get your social security number cleared through so the Secret Service can do like a background check on you. And I was ready to go, and it was canceled the day of or the night before. And I suspect that it was, it might have reached someone in Trump's orbit who doesn't really want Pence to get a lot of attention. They just want him to do his job quietly, bide his time, and run himself in 2024. which I have every belief that he will do. So he's very shrewdly waiting in the wings to one day run for president himself. But as you can see, it's kind of a jump around between administrations. I think the photos help because it's a little bit of going from Kennedy to Johnson to Carter, moving around a lot. But I do think the vice presidency is one of the most fascinating relationships in modern politics because it is this, the also-rans who are suddenly the number 2 to the president, and what is that like for your ego? And that's really the question I wanted to ask, is how do you serve somebody who you think you should have beaten in the first place? Because many times there are people who ran against them. So.